President Trump appearing at the U.S. Supreme Court this morning to hear oral arguments on one of the most controversial moves of his immigration crackdown. His attendance for arguments, a first for a sitting president. Mr. Trump seated in the front row as the justices, including conservatives he appointed, peppered the government's top lawyer with questions about the president's plan to end birthright citizenship, guaranteed under the Constitution to almost anyone born on U.S. soil.
How would it work? You're not going to know at the time of birth for some people whether they have the intent to stay or not.
Are you suggesting that when a baby is born, people have to have documents, present documents? Is this happening in the delivery room?
The Solicitor General emphasizing the president's executive order was aimed at curbing so-called birth tourism, the practice of traveling to give birth in the United States to guarantee citizenship for the baby.
Welcome to Dr. John's podcast. So what's happening right now? The Supreme Court just detonated a nuclear bomb inside Donald Trump's presidency, and the fallout is going to consume everything. What happened today inside that courtroom is beyond anything we have ever witnessed in American political history. We are not talking about a leak. We are not talking about speculation. We are talking about a sitting president getting exposed for hiding nearly $200 million in offshore accounts.
The president suggested before that he was going to go watch oral arguments. He didn't. He has been at the Supreme Court a couple times in his first term, if I remember correctly, for the sort of formal ceremonies for Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, obviously during his term, that first term. It would be a big deal if the president shows up to oral arguments, right, as the justices are hearing on both sides about this birthright citizenship issue that has been something that President Trump has been talking about for years. It would basically be rewriting the Constitution via sort of presidential mandate.
This would be a very big deal. And to our records here, this has never actually happened before. A president of the United States has never attended oral arguments, especially on a policy that he himself wants to see get across the line from the Supreme Court. Now, this is, of course, related to birthright citizenship, one of the president's biggest domestic policy items of this second term. Lower courts have all turned it down, have all said this is just blatantly unconstitutional.
While the highest court in the land watched it happen in real time. And here's the kicker. This did not even come up during a hearing about Trump's finances. This happened during oral arguments over his birthright citizenship executive order. The justices were supposed to be debating the 14th Amendment. Instead, they turned the entire proceeding into an interrogation about secret money, shell companies, and what appears to be a massive cover-up. Justice Sotomayor went absolutely ballistic. She looked directly at Trump's lawyers and asked a question that left the entire courtroom frozen. She said, essentially, how can we trust anything this administration says when the president is hiding assets from courts? How can we take your arguments seriously when your boss has $175 million sitting in foreign accounts that he was explicitly ordered to disclose and did not? Let that sink in. A Supreme Court justice from the bench openly questioned whether the President of the United States has any remaining credibility. She was not subtle. She was not polite. She was furious, and she had every right to be, because here is what the justices had just learned. Trump has been hiding money, massive amounts of money, $175 million. That is not pocket change. That is not a rounding error. That is life-changing, presidency-ending wealth, and he hid it in offshore shell companies. Foreign jurisdictions. Complicated ownership structures designed specifically to make the money impossible to track. And who found it? His own financial monitors, the people the court appointed to watch his money because he had already been caught committing fraud once before. Now let me take you back for just a moment so you understand why this is so catastrophic. Trump was found liable for massive financial fraud in New York. A judge ruled that he had systematically lied about his assets, inflated his wealth, deceived banks and insurers, and engaged in a pattern of illegal conduct that stretched back decades. The judgment against him was $355 million. That is real money. That is court-ordered. That is not optional. And as part of that judgment, the court imposed strict monitoring requirements. Trump had to disclose everything, every account, every asset, every shell company, every offshore holding. Financial monitors were put in place specifically to make sure Trump complied. The court essentially said, we do not trust you, so we are going to watch every dollar you have. And what did Trump do? He hid $175 million anyway. The The monitors discovered these accounts months ago. They found shell companies registered in foreign jurisdictions. They found money moved through complicated corporate structures designed to evade detection. They found assets that Trump had never disclosed to the court, in direct violation of explicit court orders. And they reported everything to the judges. So when Trump walked into the Supreme Court to argue about birthright citizenship, the justices already knew. They had the monitor reports, they had the evidence, they had Trump dead to rights. And the timing could not possibly be worse for Trump, because this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening while his entire administration is collapsing around him. Just yesterday, Trump was physically removed from a federal courtroom. Security had to escort him out because he threatened a judge and refused to show respect for the proceedings. That actually happened. A former and potentially future president had to be physically removed from a courtroom by security personnel. His attorney general, Pam Bondi, is being held in contempt of court. His allies are under criminal investigation for destroying evidence. Members of Congress are openly discussing invoking the 25th Amendment to remove him from office. Senators from his own party are calling for his resignation. His approval rating is below 35%. And now this. The Supreme Court discovering that he has been hiding nearly $200 million from the very courts that ordered him to disclose everything. Trump knew this was coming. That is the craziest part. Before the hearing even started, before the justices asked a single question, Trump was already posting on Truth Social. He wrote that crooked judges wanted his money and it was not going to happen. He was already panicking. He was already in defense mode. He already knew that the Supreme Court had the monitor reports and was going to confront his lawyers. And confront them they did. Justice Sotomayor led the charge, but she was not alone. Other justices joined in. They asked about the shell companies. They asked about the foreign accounts. They asked about why Trump had never disclosed this money to the courts that were actively monitoring his finances. They asked how the Supreme Court could possibly trust anything coming from a president who was apparently committing financial fraud while sitting in the Oval Office. Trump's legal team completely lost it. Instead of answering the questions, instead of providing documentation or legal arguments or any kind of legitimate explanation, they started yelling. They accused the justices of conducting a judicial coup. They said this was a witch hunt. They claimed the courts were biased against Trump and had no right to ask about his finances. They essentially threw a tantrum in the highest court in the land, and then they stormed out. They walked out of the Supreme Court rather than answer questions about $175 million in hidden offshore accounts. Think about that for a second. If Trump had a legitimate explanation, if there was some innocent reason for these accounts, if the money was properly disclosed somewhere else, his lawyers would have said so. They would have produced documents. They would have defended their client. Instead, they ran. Because there is no good explanation. There is no legitimate defense. Trump was hiding money from courts. He was violating explicit court orders. He was committing additional fraud to evade the consequences of the original fraud judgment. And now the Supreme Court knows everything. Let me spell out exactly why this is so devastating for Trump. First, these accounts were discovered by his own financial monitors. These are people whose job is to watch his money and report to the courts. They are not political opponents. They are not Democrats. They are court-appointed professionals who found evidence of what appears to be systematic deception. Second, Trump was under a specific court order to disclose all his assets. That order came from the New York fraud case. He knew exactly what he was required to do, and he apparently chose to hide $175 million anyway. Third, this money is directly tied to the fraud judgment. Trump owes $355 million in penalties. He apparently moved $175 million offshore to keep it away from the courts and creditors. That is not a technical violation. That is active evasion. That is fraud on top of fraud. Fourth, the Supreme Court has now put all of this on the official record. The justices asked the questions. Trump's lawyers refused to answer and stormed out. The court has judicial knowledge of what appears to be criminal conduct by a sitting president. That changes everything. And fifth, Trump already posted about this before the hearing even started. He knew the questions were coming. He knew the monitors had reported the accounts. And instead of preparing a legal defense, He posted on social media about crooked judges trying to steal his money. That is not the behavior of an innocent man. That is the behavior of someone who has been caught and is desperately trying to control the narrative. So what happens now? Federal prosecutors are going to open criminal investigations immediately. You cannot hide $175 million in offshore accounts and expect the Justice Department to look the other way. These are serious crimes. Fraud, contempt of court, violating court orders, potentially money laundering. This is not minor stuff. This is the kind of conduct that sends people to prison. The courts are going to move to seize the hidden money. Trump owes $355 million. He has been hiding assets to avoid paying that judgment. The courts have the authority to freeze those accounts, seize those assets, and apply them to the judgment. Trump could lose that money entirely. Congress is going to demand hearings. The House will investigate. The Senate will hold hearings. Lawmakers from both parties are going to demand answers. They are going to demand Trump's complete financial records. They are going to demand testimony from the financial monitors. And if Trump refuses to cooperate, that will be another round of contempt charges. The 25th Amendment conversation is going to get very loud, very fast. If the president is committing financial crimes while in office, if he is violating court orders and hiding money from the judicial system, there is a serious question about whether he is fit to remain president. The 25th Amendment exists precisely for situations where a president cannot discharge his duties. And some will argue that a president under criminal investigation for fraud cannot possibly discharge those duties effectively. Trump's own party is going to start turning on him. Republican senators have already been distancing themselves. Donors have already been getting nervous. Now that the Supreme Court has exposed this, the floodgates are going to open. You cannot be the leader of a political party when you have been caught hiding nearly $200 million in offshore accounts. The optics are absolutely toxic. The narrative is devastating, and the American people are going to see this for what it is: a pattern, a history, a man who has spent his entire life bending rules, hiding assets, and lying about his wealth. And now that pattern has caught up with him in the worst possible way, in the highest court in the land, during a hearing about something as fundamental as birthright citizenship. Let me also address what Trump's team is going to try to do. They are going to claim this is a witch hunt. They are going to say the judges are biased. They are going to say the financial monitors are part of the deep state. They are going to say this is all a conspiracy to destroy Trump. They are going to say exactly what Trump said on Truth Social before the hearing even started. But here is the problem for them. The evidence is not political. The monitor reports exist. The shell companies exist. The $175 million exists. The court orders requiring disclosure exist. This is not a he said, she said situation. This is documentation. This is paper. This is money that can be traced. And the Supreme Court is not going to be intimidated by accusations of bias. The justices have lifetime appointments. They do not have to run for re-election. They do not care about Trump's social media posts. They care about the law. And the law says you cannot hide $175 million from courts that have ordered you to disclose everything. This is the moment. This is the turning point. Every presidency has a moment when everything changes, when the narrative shifts permanently, when the walls start closing in and there is no way out. This is that moment for Donald Trump. Because it is one thing to argue about policy. It is one thing to debate executive orders and constitutional interpretations. It is one thing to fight with Congress about investigations and impeachments. But it is a completely different thing to be caught hiding nearly $200 million in offshore accounts while the Supreme Court watches. You cannot recover from that. You cannot explain that away. You cannot spin that into a victory. That is the kind of scandal that ends presidencies. That is the kind of conduct that leads to removal from office. That is the kind of crime that leads to prosecution and imprisonment. And the fact that it happened in the Supreme Court during oral arguments about birthright citizenship surrounded by justices who have the power to hold him accountable, that is almost poetic. That is the judicial branch saying, we see you, we know what you did, and we are not going to look the other way. Trump's legal team storming out of the courtroom told you everything you need to know. If they had a defense, they would have used it. If there was an explanation, they would have given it. If Trump was innocent, they would have fought. Instead, they ran. They yelled, they accused, they stormed out like children who had been caught stealing and had no way to talk their way out of it. That is not strength. That is not confidence. That is panic. That is desperation. That is what guilt looks like when it is caught red-handed. So here is where we stand. The Supreme Court has exposed $175 million in hidden offshore accounts. Trump was under court order to disclose those accounts and did not. Financial monitors discovered the money and reported it. The justices confronted Trump's lawyers, who refused to answer and stormed out. Federal prosecutors are going to investigate. Courts are going to seize assets. Congress is going to hold hearings. The 25th Amendment is going to be discussed seriously, and Trump's presidency is going to enter its final phase. This is not speculation. This is not hyperbole. This is the logical conclusion of the facts. You cannot be president while you are actively committing financial fraud. You cannot hide money from courts and expect to remain in office. You cannot violate explicit court orders and maintain any claim to legitimacy. The walls are closing in. The dominoes are falling. And the Supreme Court just pushed the first domino that is going to bring everything down. Watch what happens in the coming days. Watch for asset freezes. Watch for criminal referrals. Watch for congressional hearings. Watch for Republican senators to start calling for Trump to step aside. Watch for donors to flee. Watch for the narrative to shift completely and permanently. This is the end. This is the beginning of the end. And it all happened because the Supreme Court decided to ask one simple question during a hearing about something else entirely. How can we trust you when you are hiding $175 million from us? Trump had no answer. His lawyers had no answer. And now everyone knows why.